them off at an angle through that gap so they can fire with line of sight through that gap on any troops as well. Going back from that then, we've got to make sure our troops are supplied with ammunition. So I'm going to have some supply carts within range after my leaders, and these are my brigadier generals and things like that to look after these troops. My leaders are stacked somewhere in their units as well. I'm going to make sure, we've got to make sure, should I say, that our army's supplied. However, we'll probably have more supply carts than that. So that my main supply dump, if you like, will be well behind my rear, and I can use them, they're well protected, and use them as and when needed. In an ideal world, I've then got some troops in column formation, and a column formation offers a lot more mobility than it does line. As previously mentioned in other videos, that's what the formation we go to move troops over great distances, so we get a mobility advantage, if you like. It's also relatively good against cavalry, not as good as square, but it is better against cavalry than line in defence. Generally it was square, not every nation used their own. It was actually a square. The Austrians to get round training troops to get into square because it was a bit of a cumbersome and well-drilled routine, if you like. They just basically all bunched up in column and all turned face out, and they use what they call a battalion mass formation. But anyway, the game represents it as square. Going back to column then, the disadvantages of column, if you like, it offers decreased firepower. We don't have as many men in a line with as many muskets, and so we do suffer reduced firepower. It's also quite vulnerable to artillery as compared to line. If you imagine artillery passing through a line, if it's the French, it's 3D, British 2D. That cannonball potentially is only going to take 2 to 3 men. However, in column, they're all quite tightly bunched up, and that artillery could take a lot more casualties with it. So I'm using these guys as either a reserve, just in case any of my front line break, they can fill it in that gap. Or if the British do advance and that artillery isn't there and they manage to get through, we can bring them up as a sort of mini mobile reserve. We then got some cavalry. Always have my heavies, my heavy cavalry, the ones that are good against infantry, the big horses, the big men, back here with their horse artillery, and they're good to go anywhere as the need arises. We can get them through that gap to pursue any retreating infantry, or if the infantry do actually penetrate into our rear a little bit and get through everybody else, we're in a nice position to charge. They're all lined up in the direction to charge. We can bring that horse artillery with them to sort of increase the damage, increase the casualties, etc, etc. I don't have all my cavalry in that situation ready to go. My other cavalry, or some other cavalry, I would have on my flanks in general. And they would generally be light cavalry, like these lancers and hussars. Again, with their horse artillery, don't forget it's quite important to have that horse artillery with them. And they're sort of twofold, having light cavalry on my flanks. A is going to lend a little bit of weight to protecting with these light troops and guard units up here on my flank, and I can also use them if I was moving information, or if I had some terrain up here I wasn't too sure of. I could also use them to scout. They are quite good, but I wouldn't use them as an offensive weapon in the main battle. That's not a hard and fast rule. It depends what you've got on the day. But in general, in an ideal world, we're going to use our light cavalry to have a look at our flanks, or protect our flanks, and use them as scouts. What we do have in the middle is our heavy cavalry. So these carbineers and cuirassiers, and also more cuirassiers. We're going to use them as a punch weapon in the centre as and when it's needed. We could bring those two units together as well, clear a gap in the middle to pursue anybody, and have one big cavalry charge, mass cavalry charge. Back here then, we've got what I would call sort of divisional artillery or reserve artillery, the bigger guns. Now ideally they'd be situated up on some high ground, but this is just flat terrain in the editor, to overlook everybody, to inflict damage from a distance. We wouldn't want these guns necessarily on the front line. A couple of ways you can use this artillery en masse, if you like. You can do it the Napoleon way with a grand battery, gives you maximum firepower but over a relatively short area. So if these British troops were more spread out across the top of the page there, I would consider having 1 or 2, maybe even 3 batteries, depending on the terrain, where I can place them, and how many guns I've actually got. Another thing is that if the Brits did get through these lines, then we can bring these units back to either protect the artillery, we can use some of these cavalry, or my reserve units. Now, these are my big heavy guard units. Napoleon traditionally, although the old guard were elite, probably some of the best soldiers in Europe, or definitely some of the best soldiers in Europe at the time, he didn't actually use them all that much, just in case they did break, they suffered too many casualties, you wouldn't have anything left. Same sort of principle I would use and take over from Napoleon in that sense. These are my best troops, my A's, my A stars, my A double stars, and my triple stars in this case with the chasseurs. I'm going to use them as and when I need them, either to, if I break the British, to pursue them, or if somehow the British get through and all my frontline troops and all my cavalry can't do it, I can bring you in as a last gap, or a last stopgap, if you like. So they're my best troops. We've got Napoleon and his staff officers here. We want to make sure they're well out of the way, well out of harm's way, and I will bring them to bear. I like to get my leaders involved and don't just hang them back. However, don't have them right on the front line, because if you lose them, you're going to lose the advantages that go with them. So what I tend to do is, a little bit like Wellington, is just basically go across the battlefield with my leaders and put them where they're needed, because sometimes our units may break, there might be a lot of disorderment in 1 or 2 areas, we might lose some leaders, brigadier generals or division commanders, and we need a little bit of bolstering. So I would personally use my commander and my higher ups to actually go over to that area and give them a bit of a bolster. I also keep or try to keep another cavalry reserve. Again, possibly my my best cavalry. I'm going to use them in a similar vein as to what I would the heavies in the middle, but I wouldn't be so quick to use them. They are a last resort, my mobile cavalry reserve, and I'd only really try to use them to press home an advantage where there isn't much risk of losing them. I wouldn't use them in an offensive capability at all. I think what we've got to have a look at is the square formation. Now, up here, our advance guard got in a little bit of trouble with some British cavalry up here. Now, the square formation is our only go-to formation to defeat or defend against cavalry. We don't want to do it too early and get into square formation, because if there is infantry anywhere near and infantry decide to attack or attack our squares, we're going to leave ourselves vulnerable. So squares are pretty vulnerable to infantry. They're also vulnerable to artillery fire, because it will pass through one side of the square and the momentum of that ball could take it through to either of the sides of it, so we potentially lose quite a lot of men. Maybe not quite so much as column. I think in John Tiller, that's the dice roll with artillery firing against square is a little bit leading. It's a little bit light, if you like, and sometimes the casualty numbers don't correspond with what you think. Never mind. In real life, they were quite vulnerable to artillery fire. Ideally, if we can get more than one unit in square as well, so think Battle of Waterloo with the squares when they charged, cavalry is going to have chaos in there. There's going to be a lot of disorderment. We can fire on them from multiple angles because we've got that all-round defence to counteract the cavalry. Cavalry find it very, very hard to actually charge, so they'll hopefully be driven off. And the other thing with square is that if the cavalry were to move in between, if the cavalry were to move in between all these squares, if they are disordered and they move even 1 hex, it's going to pretty much use all their movement points. So they're going to get stuck in amongst all these squares, and as long as we're well supplied, we're going to have ample opportunity to have numerous opportunities to fire on these cavalry and take maximum casualties whilst inflicting the least amount of damage, or almost no damage to us, unless they decide to charge a square, which is a little bit silly. There were cases where squares were broken, but very, very rare. And the other thing is, even if they start to move and it's not our offensive fire phase, if this is a defensive fire phase, and this cavalry moves here to this hex, 1 hex down, all of these squares, because they're within range, have a high chance of an opportunity fire, so we actually get 4 free shots, if you like, and whereas our offensive shot, we can only use it once to fire on 1 target. Square, we don't really move around in it. It's, as I said, pretty poor against infantry, but it's our only go-to formation for cavalry defence. Well, that's the end of this video. Hopefully you've learned something about warfare in the age of Napoleon and how to deal with a mass formation, why I laid it out